And we're on.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to John David Ebert's YouTube channel for a very special middle of the week episode. We just have too much to talk about, and too many great people to talk to keep it to once a week. So here we are in the middle of the week with Terence Blake, all the way from France, who's come to talk to us about all the thinkers that we're into. I just want to do a quick reminder: John's Patreon page is ready and waiting, and there's lots of writings on there that you can't find anywhere else. There's lots of other ways to access John that you can't access him in any other way except through his Patreon page. And as always, Michael's book, Clouds, is available on Amazon. But without further ado, I'd like to bring in Mr. Terence Blake, who's someone who just came onto my radar, but apparently him and John and Michael have been sort of in the same nebula for quite a while now. Terence, I read something that you wrote about John's book, Art After Metaphysics, back when it came out. So you guys have sort of been circling each other for several years now. So I think this is great that this has come to pass. And, you know, there's a lot in your bio that I'd like to get to that I find interesting. But the biggest thing for me when I found out that you'd attended lectures in France, you're coming to us from Nice, France, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's it.
And before going to the south of France on your blog, it says you attended lectures by, it turns out, Lyotard, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, I just found out today, Gilles Deleuze, and Michel Foucault. And now these are thinkers who weigh pretty heavily onto what we do here on our show, Baudrillard in particular, but Deleuze as well. So I would like to maybe start there. How did you end up studying in France? About what time was this? What year did you end up going to France? What brought you out there?
Well, I was working on Feierabend in Sydney University, and I didn't have anyone in the 70s. I didn't have anyone who was very interested in those sort of ideas. And I was in a philosophy department that was interested in continental philosophy, but it was mainly Althuserian Marxism and feminism with a little Foucault thrown in. And I was sort of isolated. And then I discovered a translation, I think it was in semiotext. There was an anti-Oedipus issue and a schizoculture issue with translations of Deleuze and Lyotard. And I thought they were really great. And because that was all that was translated, I started learning French. I taught myself French so I could read the originals. Anti-Oedipus came out around then, so I could read that in English. But I taught myself French. I was working on with a postgraduate scholarship that it's amazing. I don't think things like that exist anymore. But it was had a really good living allowance, and it had a good travel allowance, and they actively encouraged you to travel to a different country and study there for a year or part of a year. So I came to Paris in 1980. I attended the lectures there of Deleuze and Lyotard. I tried to interview them. Lyotard gave me a very nice interview, and I showed him what I had written. And he said, "This is great. You should come to France and study with me." And he wrote a recommendation for a very rare French government scholarship that was mainly destined to foreign countries, to people studying in French departments. But I'd already applied for it once and I didn't get it because there's only 4 a year for all of Australia. And with his letter of recommendation, I got it like that. And so I came back in 1981, and I thought I was only going to stay 3 or 4 years. But finally, I decided I was happy. So I've never gone back. Well, I've been back 2 or 3 times to visit.
Was this a doctoral study?
It was a doctoral study, yes. But I never got my doctorate. I had only enough money for 4 years, and then I had to work, and it was impossible to do both. So
Yeah.
I dropped out.
Now, did your doctoral studies include alchemy, or was that something you came to before or after?
That was before. I'd sort of read Jung a little in the early 70s, and then sometime around 1976, I started reading Hillman, and he provided me a new way into studying Jung, reading Jung, and I I basically liked the alchemical stuff much more than the rest. Of course, Jung has went through several phases, and as far as I'm concerned, the best phase is the alchemical phase.
That's amazing.
Then I found all sorts of. That was while I was still in Australia, so I read Hillman for 3 or 4 years, and that's
and Hillman is the founder of archetypal psychology, just so people are.
Yes, James Hillman.
Yeah,
he's a sort of a second wave of people influenced by Jung, and that's what got me ready to appreciate Deleuze. Due to this factor of I was studying philosophy and there were scholarships and stuff, I had a choice in my head. I thought either I go to Japan to a Zen monastery, or Tibet, or to America to study with Hillman, or to Zurich to study with Feyerabend, or to France. But it was sort of a lucky chance that Lyotard really liked my stuff, and
Nice.
it was just that way that I managed to choose and go to France. When I was there, I was quite surprised. I went there in 1980, and Deleuze was talking about the sort of stuff that's in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. And so he'd been doing that for whatever, almost 10 years. And I thought it would be more of the same. And I remember I went into the seminar the first day, and he was talking about Bergson and the movement image. And so I was talking about the cinema, and I was totally blown away by his style. For me, after whatever 8 years of studying philosophy, that was the first time I was in a real philosophy lecture, and he was presenting an ontology where everything was made of images. So the convergence with James Hillman was just perfect.
Yeah, right. That sounds awesome. Was Deleuze approachable, Terrence? Or not? Was maybe not.
No, not really. He was very polite. So I managed to say 2 or 3 sentences to him, but he was at the same time very distant. I asked him for an interview, and he looked at his acolytes around him, and he said, "Interview? I don't do interviews. No interviews." He said he can't talk English, or he didn't like talking English, but he gave me an extract from that was in 1980. An extract from A Thousand Plateaus before it was published. I went back to Australia, and I translated it, and I tried to publish in one of these artsy magazines that were interested in continental philosophy, and they weren't interested in it. The same, I had a wonderful interview with Lyotard, and nobody would publish it because I was not in the clique that was interested in continental philosophy, and I had something that even they couldn't have gotten. And the same, I met Michel Serres. He gave me a long interview in his house. He was very nice, and nobody would publish it. So I was very glad to leave Sydney and come to Paris.
Yeah. Can I ask what chapter he gave you? Do you remember?
Well, he didn't give me a choice. Well, he gave me a choice.
Okay.
He said, "What would you like the text to be on?" And I said, on epistemology. And he looked at his acolytes again, epistemology? I don't do epistemology. Do I do it? No, you don't do epistemology. And I said, but rhizome is epistemological. And he said, oh, yes, but rhizome is an exception. And so he gave me a part of the chapter on quilts and weaving.
It's one of the ones I wasn't able to resonate with.
Well, I like it now. At the time, I didn't really.
Right.
I could see the pluralist connection and the like what with John talks about the midden heap of history, that you've got sort of patches and you can weave them together in different ways and without having a totality. So I could see that, but it didn't resonate with me. But I knew a woman who was into philosophy and into quilt making, and I wanted to publish my translation with an article by her, just on her own experience of quilt making. But once again, it didn't go into the parameters of the clique that controlled access to continental philosophy at that time. So it fell through. I had an actual extract from Deleuze before publication, which would be wildfire today, and nobody wanted it at that time.
Oh, man.
So pushing Althusser and Foucault and Lacan. So Deleuze was not on the agenda.
God forbid they find out that your background is in Jung and Hillman. They
yes.
definitely wouldn't publish you then, right? Especially.
I think they knew a little.
Yeah.
Maybe that was part of it.
I was just wrong.
They're saying Deleuze is like taking off like crazy, even more than ever before, which is funny to me. I ran in pretty radical leftist circles maybe 10, 15 years ago when I discovered 1,000 Plateaus, and it was them who introduced me because they were anarchists. So the rhizome, the concept of the rhizome was like a huge influence on them. So to me, I thought it was big at that time when I found it, but I've been told that it really is coming into its prime now in the last couple of years.
Yes, I remember a discussion where a group of people who were into Althusser, Lacan, and then Foucault were discussing anti-Oedipus, and they were saying, what? We've done all this work reading Lacan. Are we supposed to say that it was all wrong? And
okay, that makes sense.
It is. And in fact, finally they did, but it took them 5, 6, 7 years after I was gone before they got round to being experts in Deleuze, and now they're more expert in Deleuze from an academic point of view than I am. But I sort of absorbed Deleuze in an existential fashion. And sorry.
No, my fault. Well, I don't want to get too sidetracked here because I really want you guys to talk about the Deleuzian alchemy synthesis. I just want to throw out there, I was recently reading that Guattari was like a student of Lacan's, right? And he kind of rebelled against Lacan. So I never considered how that might have...
Surprise.
Right.
Slaying the father.
So I never thought about how that was in play with...
In fact, it was slaying the son, because there was a moment when Lacan supposedly was meant to choose a sort of successor, and he'd sort of built Guattari up to feel as if he would be the successor. And when it came down to the official procedures, it was Jacques-Alain Miller who was chosen. And Guattari was really upset.
That's the guy who edited the Lacan seminars, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. Just keeping track.
So supposedly he could understand Lacan and transcribe the seminars better than Lacan could. And Guattari was sort of marginalized, and who knows why. But he had written a text on machines in terms and desire, and diagram and machines to contest the notion of structure. And Deleuze at that time had written and published Difference and Repetition and Logic of Sense, and was looking for a way of going further. And I think it was Guattari who wanted to meet him, and that's where they each realized that the other had something that they needed, and the collaboration started off.
Now, can I ask, have you met Guattari?
No, I was in one class with Deleuze where Guattari turned up, and he was quite amazing because he talked more abstractly than Deleuze. He put together, Deleuze was talking about the crystal in the crystal image in the cinema. And I think I remember Guattari just sort of going on and talking about the crystal of the crystal, and sort of composing new concepts like that. And I could see how Deleuze would sort of cause all sorts of short circuits in his head if he talked to somebody like that for any length of time. So I didn't get to meet him, but I listened to one of his talks. I tried to meet.
You witnessed one of their interactions and the sparks that those two were very synergistically animated each other. That's great. You actually witnessed that.
I could see it. I could see it. I was doing short circuits in my brain after listening to Deleuze for so long, and then
what year was this, Terence? What year was this?
Guattari must have been maybe 1982 or 1983.
Okay, so they had just published 1,000 Plateaus?
They'd published 1,000 Plateaus, I think, in 1981.
Yeah.
And Deleuze was talking about the cinema. He was talking about, I think, the crystal image, which is more the time image than the movement image. So it must have been, there were 4 years on the cinema that I attended. And then 1 year on Foucault, because Foucault had just died, and Deleuze did it 1 year on Foucault. So I would say it was in 83 or 84, because that's when Deleuze was talking about the crystal image.
I still think that book that Deleuze did on Foucault is the best book ever done on Foucault, because
it's amazing.
I never fully grasped Foucault until I'd already read a bunch of him. But I never saw the structure of Foucault until Deleuze laid it out in that book. And suddenly Foucault just lit up, and I saw, the structure of Foucault in just a beautiful way. That's great. So you attended those seminars where he was working on that?
Yes. I had been attending Foucault for 4 years as well. He was into his care of the self stuff that was at the Collège de France, and anybody could go. And at the beginning, there were very few people. It was mainly sort of priests, and because he was talking about the origins of Christianity, and it seemed like a small group of priests and theologians. And little by little, it just became packed, and you'd have to get there early, or you couldn't get in. And then they opened up a second lecture room, and they would put the sound in the second room. But I sort of understood everything Foucault was saying, but I couldn't really relate to it. I couldn't see where it was going. And then he died in 1984, and Deleuze straight away it's in September that the academic year starts. So in September 1984, I think, to June 1985, he devoted the seminar to going through. It was like chapter by chapter, the stuff that you find in condensed form in the book on Foucault, and it was amazing.
Hadn't they had a falling out though before Foucault died? Hadn't they?
Yes.
What was that over?
I'm not sure, because there's all sorts of political engagements that are, and sort of group belongings that are involved with those things. But the intellectual problem was that Foucault went totally against the idea of desire, and he because it was associated with Lacan
And also
the
power.
anti.
That's the power.
Oh, the power stuff is present in Guattari and in Deleuze. It's not expressed in the same way. There is an interview with them at the time of A Thousand Plateaus where they talk about truth and power, I think, and they're relaying each other, and there seems to be sparks flying, and it's really good. But it was over this distinction. Foucault went into bodies and their pleasures. Deleuze went into desire, and a few years after, there was published, it's now been translated, a letter, a text, was a long letter, it was 6 or 7 pages maybe, that Deleuze had written to Foucault, where he tried to explain that what he and Guattari meant by desire was exactly the same thing that Foucault meant by bodies and their pleasures. And I thought it was amazing because he really went out of his way to understand and accept the vocabulary of another thinker, where most thinkers are, you use my vocabulary, that's the good vocabulary. If you use another vocabulary, in fact, you're wrong. And it's not just a question of semantics. In fact, your ideas are wrong as well. And Deleuze is one of the few I've seen who was capable of taking a paradigm that had been used to criticize him as well and go out of his way to be supple and show that he accepted that other way of talking and thinking and that it was convergent with his own. But apparently it didn't work. They might have been slightly more friends towards the end, but they never got back to the way they were friends. I think, at the end of the 60s, Foucault missed 68. So during the 70s, they were friends, I think, including theoretical friends.
Gotcha.
Well, I could, I mean, this is like, this is great, but I could do this all day. I'd love to bring in the alchemical angle, though, and the psychoanalytic angle. I think I don't know, Michael, were you about to say something?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think, Dom, you have a good point there, because Terrence, it's an honor to meet you finally, because we've been corresponding, via John David Ebert, since maybe 2015 or so, and so it's great to finally talk to you in hyper person.
Yeah.
But to Dom's point, yeah, like I really see you as, like our friend Daryl Cooper that was on a couple days ago. You're kind of like part of our group, from the beginning, and so it's just great to have you on finally, and so I see this as one of many conversations that we're going to continue. So
I sure hope so. This is great.
And
I'm not trying to interrupt, though.
No, and I think that on that one of the things that I think connects all of us is it's not only that we met through John, it's that our background is, as John puts it, in ritual. Our background is in ritual, symbol, and myth,
Right.
And then from there we branched out and discovered Deleuze or whomever it may have been, and went on from there. And so and I think I think there's something important about that I know for you, like me and John, and also like Dom, with Dom, it's coming through from literature. We recognize the importance of images, and the connection with that into that informs the way that we approach philosophical thinking now. But what I wanted to say was that I was kind of wanting to, each one of us has our own threads that we introduce on the show, our own little threads that we bring in each episode and develop throughout. And one of those threads for me is this idea of alchemy. And sometimes I feel like I'm at great pains to justify why I'm talking about alchemy or some other strange occult or metaphysical, esoteric metaphysical subject, and you really seem to get that, and so because you started out before you discovered Deleuze, before you moved to France in 1980, you were reading James Hillman, who's started archetypal psychology, and also Feyerabend, who wrote the book Against Method, and then from there you read Anti-Oedipus and also the Rhizome, that would later become a chapter in A Thousand Plateaus, and so I sort of had a similar experience coming from a Jungian background. I went to Pacifica Graduate Institute, where they have the Joseph Campbell archives, where John actually worked at the Joseph Campbell archives, and they now also have.
Actually, I had a run-in with them.
You tell a good story about
I
that.
worked there. I had a fight with them. So
yeah. I mean, my point is that there's common, there's overlaps in coming from the study of mythology, and depth psychology, archetypes, and then going out into studying philosophy, and so, but they now have the James Hillman archives at Pacifica now as well. But what I wanted to get at was I was wanting to kind of explore that with you, because this is something that I bring up a lot as I talk about alchemy and archetypes and things like that, and I feel like some people don't quite get the connection between that and some of the more high concept philosophy stuff we talk about on the show, and you wrote a review for the Hypermodernity and the End of the World book by John and our friend Brian Francis Culkin. And
yes, thank you for doing that, Terence. Very much.
I haven't finished. I've written 2 parts of a long review, so we'll continue.
Oh, that's great.
And I want to say that the first one that you wrote was actually about the preface that I wrote to that book, which might be the very first preface in all of history that someone has written a review on.
That's a good point.
So I really appreciate that, and what you wrote there totally was like you were picking up everything that I was trying to say, and such as the connection between alchemical language and alchemy itself as a way of understanding what we call hypermodernity, And then you also mentioned all these other thinkers like Baudrillard, Deleuze and Guattari, Virilio, I think was in there. You had a whole list of names of other people that were also using alchemical language.
Without knowing it.
Without knowing it, right.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember this now.
Even Zizek I put in that category.
Yeah.
Zizek? Alchemy?
He's unconsciously an alchemist.
Yeah,
right.
unconsciously.
Right. And that really is sort of, Jung's point, right? Is that we not, without even knowing it, we think alchemically, because the alchemy is sort of the language of how things transform and how things change, and it really does map on really well to A Thousand Plateaus and to Deleuze and Guattari, and according to Blake, to many other things as well. So I just was hoping that you could amplify that, say more about how, for example, how does Deleuze, how does Baudrillard, how does that, what's the connection with them and alchemy?
Well, like I say, there are lots of people who are lots of thinkers who are unconsciously Jungian or unconsciously alchemical. Deleuze, I think, he knew it. When I came over, when I was in Paris, I had access to lots of things in public libraries there were amazing, and I was able to follow up various ideas. But as far as I can see, when Deleuze was going through the 60s, he was making reference to Jungian concepts. In the Nietzsche book, he talks about Ariadne as the anima. He mentions the shadow. He mentions the self. Things that come back in a thousand plateaus, where he says the fight with the shadow is the most important thing. And in Foucault, where he talks about the self in it may be the third chapter, when he gets to the third level, of subjectivation. So, and I think Deleuze was in a little sort of circle where there was a sort of spiritual but non-denominational tendency with Marie-Madeleine Davy. I think in the 60s, there was a book by Michel Butor, who was in that circle, which is called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Ape, and which is totally based on alchemical symbolism. And so I think he sort of read a lot of Jung, and so he must have known about alchemy. And then Difference and Repetition was where he brought everything together into a synthesis, but it was a thesis for a special doctorate that doesn't exist anymore, which is a mega doctorate called a doctorate of the state. So it's not a PhD, it takes longer and it's more difficult. And he synthesized everything, but he made it all compatible with Freud, which he must have disliked, and maybe it was so horrible for him to repress all the other stuff that's why he exploded again with Guattari. So I think doesn't mean he was an active partisan of alchemy, but I think he was well aware, even afterwards, in his collaboration with Guattari, that there was a Jungian element everywhere in what they were saying. The other connection, I think it's the language. I think that was what
right, that's the alchemical language. Yeah.
What Hillman managed to show, that you don't have to follow the actual order of alchemical procedures. You can see it as a sort of vast mega text, which are
chemical psychology, where he talks about the language of alchemy as a language, like you said, that maps onto Deleuze words like intensity. What else did you say? It's like a process language, in other words, right?
Yes.
Alchemical language.
And there are all sorts of operations, like in Deleuze, liquefaction, crystallization, all those things you can find in Deleuzian language.
And you even were just using the word synthesis earlier, talking about things synthesizing, coming together, and so it's sort of naturally in the way I think this is kind of what we're trying to get at, is that subliminally we think and speak in metaphorical language, and that's the same. And the alchemists just were great artists that made that language visible in their emblems and stuff like that. But that's the way that we think. Anyway, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah.
I think as well, it would require a lot of research to establish it, but I think Lacan, I think he studied when he was young at the Bergelsli, and as far as I'm concerned, there's a link between his emphasis on the signifier and Jung's use of the word association experiments and the feeling tone complex, which are constructed around sort of networks of words. And nonetheless, whether he actively studied or knew about that, what he was doing to Freud in his rereading was, to a certain extent, but he's a halfway house for me, was getting to a more alchemical approach to Freud, bringing out the metaphors, subtracting the more Newtonian mechanics aspect. And he was influenced as well by Lacan, by the Surrealists, who were very alchemical, in fact, very Jungian, but they decided to formulate everything in terms of a loyalty to Freud, which so they were quite contradictory in their the orthodox surrealists under Breton, and
yeah.
then the others, the marginal
I knew this
surrealists
would be.
like,
I knew you and I are. We all know that we know the same stuff. You know, you know it.
yes.
I can't actually read French, or I can't read it very well. So, but yeah, that's
But
all.
French
Anyway,
is great for the alchemical aspect because it's a Latin-based language. Even more than in English, when you express yourself in French, it is more metaphorical. In maybe not really, but in the surface, it is a much more metaphorical type of language, and it's more the words being Latinate often very easily resonate with alchemical because of all solvatio, coagulatio. There's lots of operations that have in alchemy that have nouns to name them, Latin nouns, and so you either find them quite naively in French, or they just seem normal and natural in French. And then the Deleuze and Guattari, of course, like the marginal surrealists who were not necessarily favorable to Jung, because after there was all the stuff with the rivalry between France and Germany and then the war, but Artaud and René Daumal were into alchemy quite explicitly. That took priority over the Freudian meta language. So there's all that influence that is there, but was not really taken up consciously or explicitly by the thinkers. As well, when I read Anti-Oedipus and I came to France, I thought I have to, well, even be, yes, the first time I came to France, I thought if I want to understand this, I have to understand it in body and mind. So I took two decisions. I decided to go into a Jungian analysis when I got back to Australia at the end of 1980, and I decided to start learning Tai Chi Chuan to get the intensities in the body. And then I went back in 1981 to Paris, and I continued my Jungian analysis with a group that was called the New Alchemy. And it was the more radical alchemical tendency of the Jungian analysts in Paris. And they were really good because they used Jungian alchemical language to understand dreams, and at the same time they emphasized that it's not a dogma. Anything, if you dream of finding an ant in a washing machine, that was alchemical just as much as you finding salt in a retort. So they sort of opened up. They gave me more education in alchemy, classical alchemy, and they opened it up to find it everywhere in language. And at the same time, for 4 years, I was going to my alchemical analysis and to Deleuze's seminar on the cinema, and I would dream of something in the cinema class and get it explained in discussion with my analyst in relation to my life, or vice versa. Something would come up in analysis, and the next day I would go to Jung's seminar and he would say something in relation to a film that resonated directly with what I had come across in my dreams or on my analytical work. So that's private. That's the sort of rhizomic underground for lots of what I developed after. But there's always a barrier where the French can't quite go all the way. The official French philosophers can't go all the way with alchemy, but I think they sort of get it in an underhanded way as well with interpretations, radical interpretations of of Hegel and dialectics. So it's contraband. That's why Zizek is a sort of contraband alchemist. He's like Gigerish, Wolfgang Gigerish.
Yeah, one of my favorites. Yeah.
Yes.
Also, he's the third wave, sort of following
He's the
Hillman.
third wave.
He sort of revises Hillman, right? Because Hillman wrote Revisioning Psychology, which is sort of a revisioning, a turning over of Jung, and then Geigerich. I mean, some people say this. I don't know if this is Geigerich disavows this reading of him as a third wave, but you can look at it that way. Anyway.
He says he pushes off from Hillman, and if you wanted to, you could say that Hillman is the postmodern phase, and Gigerish is very close to the hypermodern phase, even if it's a classical surface.
Technology and the Soul, the volume 2 of his collected papers. I read that book at the same time that I was reading John's book on, I think it was Dead Celebrities, Living Icons. So the two in my mind kind of worked out. Exactly right. That's a really great point.
Too, Terence, that you're the only other person I've ever heard who has read Giegerich, other than Michael. Michael's been talking about him all these years, but I've never heard anyone else mention him except
Nobody seems to.
But you have to. I only discovered him because of Michael. You talked to me on Twitter, Michael, and I thought I had read him and that I hadn't liked him, but it was too long ago. It couldn't have been him. And I think I had read Guggenbühl Craig, who's another German Jungian, and I didn't like him. And so I've started reading Gigerish, but I don't have access to a real library here anymore in Nice, for English books. So I have to buy everything. And for 3 months, I searched everywhere for The Soul's Logical Life. And suddenly, I think it was Monday, I just out of habit, I looked on Amazon because they're going to reprint a lot of his stuff in a more expensive form.
I noticed that.
I searched it on Amazon, and The Soul's Logical Life was on Kindle for 22 euros. So I bought it straight away, and since then I've been reading that, and it's really, really good. I think it's essential reading, and I think it's essential for the hypermodern project.
I agree. Right. That's why I've been into him all this time.
Where is he? Where is he from? And when was he working? And what you said he comes out of the Jungian tradition? I'm not familiar with him at all.
He lives. Where does he live? In Berlin or
Berlin? Yeah, I think he's a Berlin.
He's got a German name, but I wasn't sure.
He must be 70 or something like that. Yeah. And
he's Jungian.
He's a Jungian, but his argument is
he's like Jungian. He's Jungian in the way that Lacan is Freudian. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That kind of And so Lacan goes back to Jung's actual writings a lot, and then anyway,
his interpretations of Jung's memories, dreams, and reflection are amazing. So his idea is Jung didn't understand himself, and he expressed himself in a Kantian metaphysics that is absolutely unadapted to what he was really trying to say. And so he reformulates Jung in with a pretty free style Hegel and dialectics. And what he manages to do with that is quite amazing. So I think with that he goes into Zizek's territory and goes further than Zizek in terms of the interpretation of the psyche. The problem with Hillman is he never liked individuation. He sort of felt obliged because he put the tyranny of the anima or the dictatorship of the anima as his supreme definition of soul and soul making. And Gigerish or Hillman was somebody to say, pick on someone your own size and we'll see what happens. And Gigerish says the soul is anima and animus, so the spirit, which is how John, you and Brian finish the first volume of Hypermodernity, that we need to retain science and make it transparent to the spirit. Yep. So that is in total concordance with what Gigerich says. So for me, that is you talk in terms of a hypermodern fork, but one prong of the fork is this re-establishment of spirit, and so of individuation and those other things that Hillman repressed, despite the fact that his psychology is brilliant. So that's why I think, despite his classical style, Gigerich is a really good preliminary introduction to a hypermodern analysis.
That's great. I love the way you contextualize him in that hypermodern context. Go ahead.
I should say, Terence, that my book Clouds and Absences, both books, a lot of that came out of my study of Gigerich. That was really his idea of things, which is related to the Hegelian dialectic that he's following, that the soul is absolute negativity, and things, and things are moving towards sublation. The clouds are the sublation of modernity. Hypermodernity is the sublation, which is the alchemical sublimatio. So that he's just really been a thinker that runs throughout everything that I do and think about. So it's great to hear someone talk about him and like you. But Dom, go on.
Well, I wanted to ask how Terence became aware of John, and I think it sounds like he became aware of you, Michael, through John.
Yeah.
So
which is actually kind of a funny story.
I can't wait.
Well, you can tell that story if you want. I was aware of John for maybe 10 years, I think. I was sort of experimenting with philosophy on the internet. And so I fell upon John's videos at that time, which were amazing and rich and all over the place. And I did a detour through in 2012 because I didn't know how to interact on internet or anything. Then in 2012, I discovered the lectures by Hubert Dreyfus on Heidegger, and somebody set up a discussion group on Second Life to discuss the lectures. But that didn't work out. They didn't know anything else about philosophy, and they were sort of idolizing Dreyfus and Heidegger. And I got impatient with them, and so
Dreyfus if I may interject here, I don't find Dreyfus to be very entertaining at all, because he'll talk and then he'll rewind and then he'll talk again and say, no, I don't want to say that, never mind. And he'll just keep doing that. And it's like, you can't clear presentation about what he thinks. And he's like, no, I just changed my mind, scratch all that.
True.
Like, oh, come on, man.
In 2012, I think it was, he published All Things Shining. And I had great hopes for that. And it had, because it was the return of the gods, and because it was pluralist, and he used the later phase of Heidegger to defend a form of pluralism. But it was a big disappointment at the same time, because there's an elitist element to it that I didn't like at all. And he said silly things about David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. He thought it was the triumph of nihilism because it was the ego that was trying to master everything. So that was obviously rubbish. And I wrote a review where I said I devoted, I think, half of the review to criticizing that aspect of the book All Things Shining.
We have an inside joke. We have an inside joke about Infinite Jest. That's why I had that.
Somebody commented on what usually Dom has a bookcase behind him, and there's a copy of Infinite Jest sitting there. And so one of the commenters on YouTube said, everything's great except for that infinite jest. Remove that, and you're golden.
And then he replied.
Maybe it's a disciple of Dreyfus.
And then the book came back, and he's like, "Oh, Infinite Jest is back on the shelf again." And his name is Oswald Spengler, which is funny. His moniker.
He's jealous.
You've read Infinite Jest, then. There's a guy who watches our show who goes by the name Michael Pemulus, and he's coming back at Oswald Spengler saying, "What the fuck's all this hate about Infinite Jest?" And I said to him, if I had the money, this entire bookshelf would be filled with copies of Infinite Jest.
Good.
But you know what? It's a polarizing book. I don't mean to. I think it's great fun to joke around about it, but I don't want to waylay us too much. But I
didn't mean to. Sorry. Oh, Dom. Sorry.
No, I don't want to dig down too much into Infinite Jest, but I didn't know, Terrence, that you had, because I've read All Things Shining, and
it's on Infinite Jest compared to that silly book Eat, Love and Pray.
Yes.
And that wins over Infinite Jest and they think they're doing something really contemporary when they do that. So I discovered Infinite Jest thanks to them, but I just couldn't accept the stuff they said about it. It was crazy. Anyhow, so I was disappointed with that. And, well, you might not like this. I was looking for something else. So I was aware of John's videos, and I liked reading them and reading the book he was discussing at the same time. But that's when I discovered object-oriented ontology. And I was
I like that. Which is another thing we were hoping to talk about at some point, just some of your critique of that. Harmon is a friend of the show, and we had a really great time talking to him, and I've enjoyed his work. But I know that you have some criticisms of Triple O, as we call it.
Yeah.
But anyway, go on.
Well, I was really excited by Triple O, and I thought Harmon's book I read after Dreyfus with his very strange, but in fact psycho-rigid style, despite him changing all the time. It's just his way of thinking is the only way. So I read Harmon in Tool Being, and the first few chapters were just marvelous. It was just such freedom of style, and he really did have style. But things that seemed to me doubtful were kept as dogmas. So there was something wrong with the whole difference between the sensual object and the real object that was meant to be an underpinning of Triple O, and I didn't like it at all. I think it was demonstrably wrong. But if you allow them that, most of what they say is quite nice. Timothy Morton writes interesting books, but he insinuates that it's founded on this ontology, this ontological base, and I don't think it is at all. So I started trying to discuss that, and I met with a blank wall. So I became, because it was my beginnings on internet, I became very polemical to insist that I had a point. And
I remember that.
Yes.
I remember how polemical you were being back then.
Yes. So that was the beginning. I didn't know how things worked. But that got me to be very clear, very articulate, very structured in my thought. And the people who were discussing Triple O were discussing Badiou and Laruelle and the thinkers of the hour, and Deleuze and Foucault and so on, the recent thinkers. So I turned more to that because I found them more interesting, richer, and more satisfying. So, and the more I worked on them, the more I felt I was converging with the ideas that John was expressing in his particular synthesis. So I just kept on getting more and more interested.
Can we dig down just for a second on why you take issue on the difference between real and sensual objects?
Well, I don't follow the books anymore,
Okay.
but I did a really close analysis of Harman's book, The Third Table, where he talks about the difference, the two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, and the third option, which is the real objects. So there is quite clear that the real object doesn't have any sensory qualities at all. It can't be described. It can't even be thought. And it can't be, he considered mathematics and science insofar as it uses mathematics was a form of reductionism. He's got two forms of reductionism, overmining and undermining.
Right.
So undermining is when you break it down into little pieces like atoms or elementary particles of whatever form, not necessarily physical ones. And overmining is when you have some sort of overarching substance like society or language or human being or whatever. And he says neither of them capture the real object. So you've got something that you can't say anything about. And that's when he's talking explicitly about his ontology. And
So
then
it
when he
reminds
wants
me
to
of
talk,
Kant again. I mean,
yes, it's very
Good.
Kantian. And then when he's
Denunciation.
talking about a real domain like architecture or Lovecraft or painting, he will talk about the use of objects and their relations in those domains. And what he says will sound very interesting, but he omits to say everything I'm saying there is in fact in the sensual realm because I'm talking and I'm saying things, and the real ontology is something else entirely.
Right.
So people have the illusion that they're getting to the real by talking about objects, and according to his own theory of withdrawal, they're falling short. And I found in the past that he used the ambiguity to appeal to people who might not have felt the same appeal if he explained that all of that was just the sensual level. So,
I didn't mean to cut you off.
for example, in the book, The Quadruple Object, he says at the beginning, people think that there are processes or relations or whatever. I'm in my room, I look around, I see all these objects. And that sort of may strike you as a revelation, but all the objects he names are unreal. But he doesn't say so. He talks about it's like you're getting into the world because you're getting to objects. And the crucial point, which comes up later in the book, but he doesn't put them in contact, is that all these objects that he names, by the very fact that he can name them and perceive them, are sensual and not real. So, but on your discussion with him, at one point he said the COVID-19 virus is a real object. And I thought, well, that's strange because science was meant to be just dealing with sensual objects. So he's changed. So I can't really comment on his latest. Maybe he was influenced, although he would never admit it. Maybe he was influenced by my critiques and other people's critiques to soften up or modulate that distinction. But in the beginning, it was something unacceptable and not fully frank, I would say, in the way parts of the presentation were written.
Well, he does say somewhere that I think one of the things he wants to do is bring philosophy into the realm of the sciences, because I think he thinks that the popular opinion is, well, science and mathematics have figured the world out, So philosophy is a humanities. Philosophy can't really tell us anything about.
It's superfluous.
Right.
Is the assumption. Yeah.
And I think his whole project, from my understanding, is to sort of elevate or bring philosophy back into that realm. To say philosophy is not superfluous.
True. This is one thing I've said. People have always identified me with a criticism of O, but I've said it several times on my blog that you're not going to be able to criticize O effectively if you don't see its positive points. And I said the two things that I admire about Harman are his style, because when he gets going, he has a really good style.
He does.
Not all the time. And secondly, his anti-scientism. That he's the given that all these people, all those, especially physicists like
John
Hawking and what?
John loves that about Harman, the anti-scientism.
Well, it's true. I love it too. Hawking wrote. No, is that ironic?
No, I meant that. I didn't mean that as a criticism. It's a good. It takes me back to Heidegger.
Well, true. So Hawking and people like that
should be anti-science.
Oh, Hawking, yes.
Is over. Philosophy is over. And Harman wrote a rebuttal of Stephen Hawking's criticism of philosophy, and I fully agree with him there. So I'm not against everything he says, but I just think there's something shady about his basic ontology.
Well, the objects are shady. That's what he's saying.
Yeah. Well, Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, the world divides up into facts, not things.
I almost think that there's actually maybe a connection between some of what you're doing and what he's saying in some sense, because it sounds like he's sort of saying that we can't really talk about objects through a scientific idiom or this or that. That he's wanting to bring in the humanities, almost like James Hillman wanting to bring in, we have to look to the arts, poetry, alchemy. These, like for example, for Harman, it's Lovecraft, for example, is a way of maybe that's our access to objects is through the poetic, the poetical modality, I suppose.
That's fucking perfectly well said, Michael. I agree with you. I think that's why he focuses on Lovecraft, actually.
Well, he says so, but at the same time, in other places, he says language can't get to objects. So it reminds me of the criticism of Wittgenstein. So just on a side note, Harman starts out as if it's obvious once you think about it, everything is objects. And the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of Wittgenstein begins with the world divides into facts, not things. And for him, it was obvious that the world divides into objects in relation in terms of facts or states of affairs. So neither one is obvious. But the conclusion of the Tractatus is whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And a famous mathematician, Ramsey, said, you can't say it and you can't whistle it either. So Harman at some points says you can't say anything about, well, if you go through the list of things you can't say about objects, you can't say real objects, you can't say anything. And then suddenly he says, but you can whistle it, and that will be Lovecraft or other things. So, I mean, if you want to take a hard line, really logical approach, there's something wrong with that basis. But if you're willing to sort of let that float, lots of the things he says, I'm quite okay with. And I like his Lovecraft book, and I like much of his style. And I came out and praised his article, his rebuttal of Stephen Hawking. So at the same time, it doesn't reach the level of sophistication that I can find in Badiou, whose Badiou just gets better and better I would say his new book that came out 2 years ago, the third volume in the Being and Event trilogy. I don't know about how you would say the first book is categorized, but I would say Logics of Worlds, which is translated, corresponds to the postmodern phase, and the Immanence of Truths, which is not translated, but I did the first summary in English of it, is hypermodern in many ways. So anyhow, I find Badiou far more sophisticated.
I've lost track of Badiou since I read Being an Event. Didn't read Logics.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's okay. Logics is more pluralistic,
okay,
but he persists in saying that the basis is set theory, and one particular, the ZFC set theory. So that sort of limits everything, despite the fact Logics of Worlds is category theory, and you've got lots of different worlds.
right.
And then in the Immanence of Truths, which came...
so this is volume 3?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not aware of it.
It came out 2 years ago. It's another whopper, 600 or 700 pages, and it's based on all the recent mathematics of infinite and very large infinite numbers. And I'll show you something that I've never showed anyone.
Aren't those almost an equivalent of hyperobjects, though? Very large, infinite numbers. Aren't those sort of like the mathematical version of hyperobjects?
Well, the hyperobjects are what makes them hyper is that they're not infinite. They're just very large beyond what we can appreciate, with our own.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Can you see this?
Yeah.
The Immanence of Truths. So it's 688 pages.
Terence, you remember what? Did you ever hear what Hubert Dreyfus in one of his lectures? I remember him dismissing Badiou and saying Badiou's not a real philosopher. He privileges mathematics as an ontology, and you can't do that. Have you heard him say that?
Yes, I remember that.
What do you think about him saying that?
One, it's stupid.
Yeah.
Secondly,
that was my.
Badiou has explained on several occasions that he didn't exactly say or he didn't mean it. Sometimes he equivocates that mathematics is an ontology. He meant that mathematical language is the ontological language, and that he doesn't even really mean that. I think lots of these French thinkers sort of think there's a famous metaphor in Althusser about which he did after his most scientistic phase with reading Capital and whatever. I think it's in Lenin and Philosophy, where he no longer gave priority to science. There's this metaphor of the bent stick, that when the stick is bent in one direction, you have to bend it strongly in the other direction so it can find the position of equilibrium. And he considered, after the fact, Althusser did, that when he went overboard on science, that was a way of, because it had been bent too far in the humanities direction, that he was able to make the stick straight again by bending it too far in the science direction and then letting it go. So Badiou, he sort of says something like that. Maybe he's not fully convincing if you look at some of the stuff he says, but he's really someone who, because of his idea of the four truth procedures, you've got mathematics and science, love and psychoanalysis, and maybe religion is in there too, poetry and the arts, mainly poetry, and politics is the fourth, that when he gives abstract exposition and he gives examples, he often makes a real effort to give examples from each of those domains, Whereas most thinkers, they'll think of only one type of example, and it will easily prove a preconceived notion. He will really go to an effort to take 4 totally different types of example, and suddenly it illuminates them and their interconnections in a way that you wouldn't get if you thought that there was only one that was the base. So he sort of gives a priority to mathematics, and then in lots of his discussions, he puts it on the same level as the 3 other truth procedures. So anyhow, the thing I've never shown anyone.
Derail you from.
Yeah, what were you going to show us? That
I don't know if you can see that. That's Badiou's writing.
Oh, that's Badiou's writing.
For Terence Blake.
So I got hold of the manuscript for his book before it was published by I don't know how. I wrote to his secretary saying, "My name is Terence Blake. I've got a blog where I talk about French philosophy. Could I have a review copy of Badiou's new book?" And she replied, "Yes, sure, you can have an advanced manuscript." And then I read it during the summer holidays 2 years ago, and I found errors or misprints in the really technical mathematical parts. And so timidly I sent 2 or 3 of those to his secretary, and she showed them to Badiou, and he said, "Yes, they're mistakes," and he corrected them. And I asked, "Should I continue?" And he said, "Yes, continue." And then he sent me a copy of the book, which says, "For Terence Blake, who has read my book better than anyone." I wish he had stopped there, but he continues. He found 6 misprints in the book. Very warm regards, Badiou.
I want to pause and just point out, on the Hypermodernity show, you have an editor for Alain Badiou in Terence Blake, and you have the proofreader of Peter Sloterdijk from Semiotext in John David Ebert. So you can't get this content anywhere else on the internet.
That's right.
A good point.
We have the guy who read Sloterdijk. Probably, John, I've sold you like this before. I said this to people who've never heard of you. This is the guy who read Sloterdijk before anyone else in America did. I don't know if that's true. It's probably true.
Pretty much the case.
That's awesome. Hey, I want to ask, and then I'll turn it back over to you guys. But Terence, have you had any opportunities to kind of look over what you think of some of the English translations of Baudrillard and Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari? Do you have any opinions on those, or have you read them? You don't need them.
I have commented on translations. I mean, it's tough. I'm bad at translations, but I'm good at comparing the original with the translation. So I've done a couple of commentaries on, I think the longest one I did was on the first couple of pages of Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? And I showed how the translation, while correct, missed out on all sorts of implications in the French words that were sort of banalized by the translation into English. And that's where a second time I went the whole hog there, because I was reading the Badiou book, which is on different sorts of infinity, and I managed to show that What is Philosophy, which seems to be talking about the invention of concepts and so on, the favorite word in the book, which occurs at least once on almost every page and sometimes twice, is infinity or the infinite, or paraphrase, the outside, even more outside than any outside, or the absolute speed or infinite speed, and so on. And that are, in fact, the 4 main types of very large infinites that Badiou analysed in great length in his latest book were present in the Deleuze and Guattari book, What is Philosophy, but sort of almost undetectable, and certainly didn't show up in the translation. So I usually say that when I do something like that, that I'm not criticizing the translation, because you can't do everything in a translation, and I don't think I could translate a big book. Well, I could, but it probably would take me 10 years, because I would worry over almost every word. Yeah. But I think you miss out important things in the translation of Deleuze's books. I couldn't really comment on. I did a similar thing, I think, on Derrida. I took Structure, Sign and Play. I think it was one of the first important texts of Derrida to be translated. Structure, Sign and Play in the Human Sciences, something like that. And I showed.
You wrote.
Yes, I analysed the first couple of pages, and I showed that there's sort of key words that when you read them, they sound like concepts that anyone who knows philosophy knows what it is, so you can translate it directly. But quite often it's sort of coded. It includes references to other thinkers who've expressed themselves before, and that Derrida is alluding to, like Deleuze was alluding to as well. So
it's kind of like Paul Celan's poetry, where you really can't translate it into English because there's lots of puns that don't get carried over, and
True.
Allusions to each word. It might have multiple allusions that you're going to miss.
But yes,
so you have to read him in both languages. I have a little bit of German, enough to know the German if it's compared to his original, and they're very different poems. The English and the German. It's essential to read the German versions as well.
Yes, but otherwise the notes would have to be twice as long as the book you translate. So at least.
But Terence, I just want to, I don't want us to run out of time before we get to this. So there's a couple of things. So I'm hoping that before we close, we can talk about Peter Kingsley's book Catafalque, which we've both been critical of, and I've sort of took my cues from.
One of you liked it. I mean,
you on that, but yeah, but
I liked it in the sense I thought you had to read it.
But before we get there, I just read something today. On Agent Swarm, your blog, you put something up that you actually wrote in 1984 called "The Image is the Measure." And
yes, that was my most Humanian article at that time.
Yeah, and I think that I was sort of thinking that just briefly, because you talk about a couple of things that I think are important. Well, many things that are important, but for the context that we're in today, just the idea of, you talk about Paul Feyerabend's epistemology of incommensurabilities and James Hillman's archetypal psychology. And I was hoping that if you could unpack that so people can understand how James Hillman and archetypal psychology, how that's connected to pluralism generally and incommensurability, because I don't think most people know what we're even talking about with that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Well, it's sort of obvious to me, or it was obvious when I first read. I think The Myth of Analysis and Revisioning Psychology. Hillman just begins with a archetypal pluralism that it's almost the same move, although he doesn't make it explicit in that text, as Anti-Oedipus, that begins with just saying Oedipus is just one image or one set of archetypes, alongside lots of other archetypes or images that are active in the human psyche.
And by archetypal pluralism, you mean this sort of idea that that an archetype is a sort of, it's a point of view, and that shapes the way that it sort of shapes our perceptual semiotics in a way, and that there's multiple.
There are multiple semiotics you're influenced by and moved by and concerned with all sorts of things in the world, in ideas, in the media, and it can't all be reduced to one simple key, that behind it all is the Oedipus complex.
Right. It can't be reduced to one archetype. There's multiple. Yes. It can't be reduced to, for example, like objects, right? That would be one archetypal fantasy.
True.
For Hillman, for example, that you might find in Triple O, right? It can't be reduced to mathematics. It can't be. There's multiple primordial, archaic, principles of perception that are like they're like gods projected out in polytheism. And Hillman is trying to sort of, Jung has that as well, but Jung is almost more of a monotheist because it's about the self, the center of all the archetypes, the god that organizes, like Zeus on top of Olympus, that is the king of all the gods. But then Hillman is saying, well, actually, that's just one of many fantasies. He's relativizing that fantasy, the fictions of the ego and the self, amidst all these other archetypal fantasies that we have. And where I'm going with this is that you connect that to postmodernism. And you say that Hillman is actually sort of a link to postmodern pluralistic thought, in a sense.
Well, then we get into the problem with the understanding of postmodernism.
Yeah.
I'm a special case because when I came to Paris in 1980, I had never heard of postmodernism, and I read the book that had just come out. So I was in Paris and I read The Postmodern Condition by Lyotard, and I went to, I had a long interview with him then, and the book, there were two books published at almost the same time. It was Just Gaming, which talks about a polytheism, but it expresses it in terms of different language games. But he does talk about the different gods and how you can find them in your psychological experience and in your political strategies. And the Postmodern Condition came out maybe a couple of months later, or at least it was conceived a little later. And it talks about the postmodern condition, but it's not the postmodernism that you find when people say, oh, it's just your opinion, everything can be true for you. In fact, he used, in the postmodern condition, the language game ontology to highlight the development of what he called telematics. So it was before the internet, but it was the rise of information technologies. And as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the normal use of postmodern today, the Postmodern Condition by Lyotard is a halfway house. It's a transition between postmodernism as it's understood in America or in English today, and hypermodernism. Because Lyotard had been postmodern in the everything is okay sense, in libidinal economy, where he talked about the play of intensities. It was sort of in Freudian, Deleuzian language, and all intensities are okay, and everything that you talk about can be analyzed in terms of intensities, and the aim is to let the intensities flow as much as possible. And that was a sort of thought experiment for him to push something that he'd been sort of working on, and he had been working through Adorno and the modernist, above all, aesthetics, and he then he combined in his own way Freud and Marx, and he wrote Libidinal Economy. But straight away, so that was published in 1974, but pretty quickly that was criticized as being crypto-fascist, because if everything's okay, so is fascism, so is violence, and so on. And to
like a moral relativism, like moral.
So it was
relativism.
total relativism, yeah. Even if he insisted in the book that it was not just all intensities. You had to refine your intensities, but no, it was not clear why you had to refine them. And so his turning point, which is in fact away from postmodernism, was in the book where he talked about being postmodern. That's the postmodern condition. And he was talking about information technologies before internet. So the postmodern condition for me is a book where he was going towards hyper modernity. So there's a mismatch with the way the words are used today. And in 1980, these things were not defined in the same way. And for me, you can find it, I'm pretty sure that you can find it in the French philosophers, that Lyotard was a postmodern. Before, when he wrote Drift Works, I think it's called in English, and I'm not sure what the other one is in English. He was modernist. In Libidinal Economy in 1974, he was, to all intents and purposes, postmodern. And in the postmodern condition, he was in fact going towards hypermodernity. And when he wrote how do you pronounce it in English? The different, for me, he was already hypermodern on one of the forks of hypermodernity. And I remember I talked to him, and I said, but alchemy is really interesting. The body without organs in 1,000 Plateaus is the Philosopher's Stone. And he said, yes, but I think Deleuze is still too much inside the signified. And in fact, I didn't like it when he said that, because I liked the connections I've been creating. But in fact, when Deleuze and Guattari published What is Philosophy in 1995, I didn't like the book at that time. I thought it was a regression, that it was terrible. But in fact, the second favorite word, aside from infinity, was concept, and the third favorite word is spirit. So I think they were at that time taking the hypermodern turn, without using that vocabulary, that they were sort of revising. Deleuze always said postmodernism was rubbish, and there's some strange snobism where, like I said, Baudrillard was not well appreciated by the hyper philosophical thinkers in France, and Lyotard was really strong during the 80s, and then he just sort of faded away.
Yeah, he did.
There was something, not just in English, but in France as well, despite the fact that it's, well, incredible, some of the stuff he wrote. But anyhow, I think, despite rejecting postmodernism, Lyotard made the connection. He wrote a book, he wrote an article where, because often people say, oh yeah, because you're English, because you're Americans, you group these people together, but they've got nothing in common. Foucault and Deleuze and Derrida and Lacan, they don't see each other as working in common. But in fact they did, and they all had their eyes on each other. And Lyotard, in one of his texts, where he was replying to Habermas, said, the thing that Habermas doesn't understand about the French thinkers is that we're all into the play of incommensurabilities. So, and then he gives a list and he says Deleuze and the incommensurabilities of sense, Michel Serres and the incommensurabilities of science, and Derrida and Lacan, and he just sort of says they're all doing the same thing as me, Lyotard, and as Wittgenstein. He included Wittgenstein for some reason. And so for them, and that was his definition of postmodernity, which is already making postmodernity transparent to the spirit. And so after, for me, what is philosophy is more, after the book on Foucault by Deleuze, at the end, if you remember, he talks about the new figure after the death of man, and it will be based on silicon. And that's sort of, in fact, a foreshadowing of his article on the Control Society. And I think that's behind the new attitude that you've got in What is Philosophy. So, and as I said, Badiou has gone in a hypermodern, even if all this vocabulary is sort of all ambiguous, and you got precursors and ambiguous and hybrid cases and so on. I would classify Logics of Worlds in postmodern, even if he would kill me if I said that to him. And the new one, the Immanence of Truths, is more in the sort of hypermodern direction that you and Brian and Michael are producing. And I think there's someone else who's in that line. Laruelle, in a sense, his most recent book, which I'm the first, despite the Laruelle, I'm the first to give a good summary of that in English by highlighting everything he says about science fiction. And that's a break with the stuff that made him most famous on non-philosophy. Now he's doing non-standard philosophy, and you could say that that's going in a hypermodern direction.
Let me ask you, Terence, I love the way you're doing this. You're taking these, what I would think of as just as primarily postmodern philosophers. You'd say, well, they're postmodern up to a point, but now they're taking a hypermodern swerve at a later point. I really love how you're contextualizing them that way. Would you ever think of, because I would love to see you do like a paper that talks about that and talks about how these guys, when suddenly that it's no longer postmodern, now it's hypermodern. At this point with, the new Badiou book, or, Giegrich is hypermodern, whereas Hillman's postmodern. It'd be wonderful would you ever think about doing a paper on it?
Well, I would like to, but
but it's great.
Either it's like for translation, either it's a 5-year thesis to work on, or something that I can do in bringing together, because I said I wanted to write a paper for the book you were projecting for the summer.
The anthology, yeah.
So I would like to cobble together some of the things I've written on
perfect.
These recent books that I didn't have
awesome.
modernity in mind when I wrote the stuff.
We can always transcribe some
you
of
got to come back. We need to do a whole episode on this, because John, I was going to say more or less the same thing. I think that would be great if we could tease some of that out, because now I want to go back and look at these.
Yeah, it gets you thinking.
Look
at these guys in a different light now. It's like we're playing a game here. We bat the ball at Terence, and now the ball's in our court. Now he's batted it back. Now we got to say, well, now wait a minute. We have to rethink what we're doing here a little more circumspectly. No, it's wonderful. It's a great dialogue. Going across the Atlantic.
That's it.
Before we have to close, I really wanted you to just give a quick critique of Peter Kingsley's Catafalque, and because it seems like it's a book that's made a lot of waves and is popular especially among people who have actually never read Jung or any of the classical Jungians, and then that book sets itself up as like this this is the real Jung that you're getting from Kingsley, and it's sort of preposterous in my opinion, as someone who's been reading Jung my whole life, and I think I just not seeing what his point is really. And you had some good writings on that. Do you think you could summarize some of that real briefly?
Well, in a sense, I would apply Hillman, who he what is a polite way of saying it, who he disses on from the very beginning of Catafalque, and Gigerich. So I would say lots of what he says, criticizing the Orthodox Jungians, is exactly what Hillman and Gigerich say. In The Logical Life of the Soul, I'm up the soul's logical life. I'm up to the chapter where he's gone through the idea that we have to find the concepts that are implicit in Jung. He's gone through some of the orientations that you can find in Jung's works, including Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And now he's going a chapter to the errors of the Orthodox Jungians. And he says lots of the same criticisms that Kingsley says. And he even takes some of the same chapters or quotations that Kingsley uses to what he thinks are a great effect.
Which is wild, because all he does is Kingsley rips on his predecessors in a really uncharitable way, as though there was no one other than him that understood Jung, and that
because of his amazing experience with the goddess. So maybe he had some amazing experience. Maybe he did go and incubate somewhere. I watched a couple of films. I bought a couple of his films because to listen to him talk, you have to pay. Where he talks about a dream where he was on a mountain. And have you seen this one? He started doing a Jungian analysis, and he was on a mountain with all sorts of strange, complicated hieroglyphics, and there were people all over the mountain working on it, doing minutious research, going higher and higher. And the analyst supposedly said, get down off that mountain, come down to the ground, ground yourself. You're not supposed to be on that mountain. You're a human being who walks on the earth, or something like that. And that sort of broke his energy. And he talked with some guy who's written several books, who met Jung, who had a similar sort of dream.
Well, Wolfgang Pauli had a dream like that too, that Jung interprets in Psychology and Alchemy. Wolfgang Pauli, the dream about the Rainbow Bridge.
Yes.
Pauli Jung suggested he has to walk under the bridge because only the gods can walk on rainbows. And if you walk on the rainbow,
I think that's a bad side of Jung. It seems, well, it depends. Who knows? But
it's comparable, though. The way I get it, it's
yes.
comparable to what you're saying about
you have to decide in each context. Is it a neurosis fleeing from life, or is it some amazing spark of creativity? And if you think it's a neurosis, you'll bring them down. And if you think that there's something creative going on there, you'll encourage them to keep on the mountain or keep on the bridge.
So what do you think that Kingsley was being encouraged to come down from the mountain, Rainbow Mountain?
If you want to be really nasty, maybe he should have come down.
Maybe he should have come down.
His high horse, his high mountain.
So
nobody likes that.
Okay.
I remember the guy who was the head of the New Alchemists, the alchemical Jungian analyst in France. In one of his books, he at least had some power of self-criticism. He had a patient who had a dream similar to that. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't say what the dream is, and he brought him down to earth. And that night, he dreamt that he saw this guy in an incredibly beautiful symphony, and the music was just so incredibly creative and beautiful. And so the next time he saw him, he apologized for his interpretation and said, that's the way you must go on. So you never know. And you can become sort of systematically deflationist,
right, yeah.
where it's not right. But anyhow.
Very different from Hillman's approach, too, with dream. Hillman is just letting the image be a living thing, like an animal that comes into the room.
So he would never say, come down to earth off the mountain.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I don't think Gigerich would. Gigerich would say, yes, at last you're getting to the concept. That's the way to go. So his complaint, Kingsley's complaint about Jungian analysis is justified, but it's selection bias. He's taking sort of bad or not on the ball analysts, and he's generalizing that, and he thinks he's the only one who's seen through that.
And he's doing it to always make himself seem like he's somehow superior. It's a very strange, there's something there that it's just really was difficult slogging through his book. It just seemed like it's all about how there's only like a few people that really have kept this tradition of wisdom alive, going back to, you know, Empedocles and Pythagoras and you know, like and it's Jung and it's Kingsley that are the only ones that really know the truth of what the ancient Greeks knew. You know, that's I mean, that's almost literally like what he's saying. I mean,
true.
I don't know. Yeah.
And his way of doing it is
Parmenides, not Pythagoras. Sorry, Empedocles and
Parmenides. Yes.
Parmenides, yeah.
But he doesn't talk about Heraclitus because
very important point. Yeah, he doesn't talk about Heraclitus.
Too flowing, too fluctuating, too liquid for him.
Yes, right.
And I don't know. You've read more Gigerich than me, but I would have thought that Gigerich would like Anaxagoras because he puts mind as the supreme principle, which makes one think of some forms of Zen Buddhism. And so Gigerich would interpret everything that Catafalque takes literally, including the dream about the end of humanity. Gigerich would take that as metaphorical of passing to the spirit and the concept. So the ordinary idea, because there are no prophets for Gigerich. So Kingsley, well, maybe he's going too far, who knows? But Kingsley is certainly not a prophet. And so and Jung was not a prophet, or
yeah, but you get the impression from Kingsley though that Jung should be seen as a prophet. I mean, that's kind of how.
Well, there you are. He can't take Jung metaphorically. So Jung's final dreams, that really makes it incredibly intense. It's his final dreams, and even Marie-Louise. Yes.
I don't want to arbitrarily cut you guys off.
No, that's great.
I'm gonna tune out, and you guys can keep going.
Terrence, we'll definitely continue this. That was awesome. I'm really glad we got a chance to talk about that too. But let's we're definitely going to continue. Have you on again. I mean, this is great.
Yes, with pleasure.
You're one part of our.
Absolutely necessary.
Dom, close us out, buddy.
Well, I think we found a kindred spirit here.
Oh, for sure.
I don't even know what to say.
We could go on for hours.
Yeah, we
could go on and on. Yeah.
I'm very happy with this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to do it again.
I almost was going to say, I think we found our fourth co-host.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
all right, Terrence, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
It's very stimulating.
We'll look forward
to
having
our anchor in France. He's reporting from France.
Yeah, we got a lot more to cover, so we'll see you again shortly.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Nice
Bye,
meeting
everybody.
you,
Bye.
and we'll be back.
We'll be back.
Yes.